Hello and welcome back to Drilled. I'm Amy Westervelt. In a little under a week, the annual UN Climate Summit, the Conference of the Parties, it's called that because these are all of the people who are party to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, or the UNFCCC, and they meet every year to talk about what their governments are going to do about climate change. This is year 30, and I think it's fair to say that this process is facing a real crisis of legitimacy at the moment. This year, the U.S. government has barred any of its officials from attending to negotiate, so that should be interesting. For the last couple years, the gloves have been completely off when it comes to fossil fuel executives being involved in this process. We had first COP28 in Abu Dhabi, where the president of the national oil company was also the president of the climate summit. And then last year in Baku in Azerbaijan, where similarly loads of folks involved in the petroleum business were part of the COP organizing committee, and there were just blatant oil deals happening all over the conference. This year's COP is being held in the Brazilian Amazon, which is quite interesting. And the Brazilian government and the conference organizing committee have really made a commitment to information integrity around climate. They want to highlight this issue. They would like to see something around information integrity actually being adopted into the final commitments coming out of this COP. And they have made a big commitment to keeping things like climate denial out of this conference. However, as we know on this show, there are lots of different ways that disinformation can make its way into climate conversations. And what we're going to talk about today is the way that climate obstruction makes its way into international negotiations. So not just the COP, but also the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. These are not, super objective, uncorrupted, and uncorruptible processes as much as they are often described that way and as much as we might like for them to be. So today, a very interesting conversation with Kari de Pryck from University of Geneva and Eduardo Viola from the Institute of International Relations in Brazil about how climate obstruction shows up in international negotiations. That conversation is coming up after this quick break. I'm going to start with the very, very basics, which is to have you guys define for people what is the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and why are we looking at these bodies for climate obstruction?
The United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change is the basic document, the foundational document of the climate regime. Okay? The most important thing is it settles the goal that humanity should reduce emissions for avoiding dangerous climate change. This was a very important document signed in 1992, was a very important example of multilateralism at the end of the Cold War, and with the optimistic spirit, let's say, of great potential of human collaboration. Okay.
And we have the UNFCCC because the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, was established in 1988, before the UNFCCC was established, to build the case scientifically for an international climate negotiation. And since the 90s, the IPCC has been producing main assessment reports. So now we are entering the seventh assessment cycle, and all those reports and assessments have been the scientific basis of the negotiations. That's why the IPCC does play a key role in how we understand the climate problems as well as the solutions. It's being discussed a lot in the negotiations. And that's why we also wanted to include it, because it's quite related. And we often see that many of the experts the government representatives, they actually travel from IPCC to UNFCCC meetings. So there is a clear connection and links between those two institutions.
Great. Okay. And you mentioned in the chapter that there's only kind of recently been research that's laid out a framework for looking at obstruction in the UNFCCC. Can you say a little bit more about that? What is that research and what is the framework for looking at obstruction?
So there has been already quite some research on climate obstruction in the UNFCCC by Joanna de Pryck, for instance, but they were focusing on some specific countries. And what we've seen with the publication recently by Daniele Falzon and her colleagues is this kind of first attempts at having a comprehensive framework of what climate obstruction means in the UNFCCC. And in their paper published in Global Environmental Politics, they do identify 4 different main ways to do obstruction. One being limiting the scope of an issue, whether it's being only discussed within a dialogue, whether it's going to lead to some decisions that parties are supposed to take into account. We have also the question of reducing transparency in terms of how much data is available to understand a specific problem, knowing that the authors actually used the case of loss and damage in their study. We have also questions around manipulating language. How are we going to define and speak about loss and damage? And for instance, there is this interesting case in the negotiations where the negotiations would use and speak of loss and damage in the singular and with capital letters, whereas in the IPCC and in some of the technical discussions in the UNFCCC, they will mention losses and damages, so using the plural and lower cases. And the final element is the question of promoting non-transformative solutions, so solutions that do not necessarily question the structural aspects and reasons that are responsible for the climate crisis we are in.
Yeah, I would like to add a kind of more structural dimension of obstruction. That is, what are the basis of the behavior of states? And it's a lot related to some structural dimension. Like, for example, the carbon intensity of their economies, the level, the share of global carbon emissions, the per capita emissions, the dependence of their economies on fossil fuels. So those issues are not matter of negotiation, but they shape the behavior of most states, not all the states, but most states. And so there is always present in the negotiation this, that the states don't want to do, for example, if they have high carbon intensity in their economy, don't want to reduce the carbon intensity, or if they have a trajectory of growing carbon emission, they don't want to diminish the growing trajectory of their carbon emission, and so on.
Right. And that comes up in the IPCC as well, right? That the higher, well, at least the fossil fuel producers or the bigger ag producers tend to bring those issues in at the IPCC level as well, right? Not just at the COPs for both.
Yes, totally. And maybe to name a few, so what we have seen from different studies is, we have the usual suspects like Saudi Arabia. For instance, there has been a lot of work on how the Saudi is trying to obstruct the deliberations within the UNFCCC and the IPCC. But we have also seen, notably around questions of loss and damage, equity issues, the United States as well, European countries also being more and more critical about acknowledging what it means to take seriously, especially financially, what it means to take loss and damage and compensation seriously. But we have also seen Global South countries as well, and Eduardo probably knows better, but also countries like China, Brazil, India also also tend to try to put more emphasis on their right to development, not acknowledging that today they also are big economies and also pollute far more than they did 10 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, actually, I wanted to ask you to define the principle of common but differentiated responsibility and respective capabilities. Can you define what that means and how it gets leveraged in these negotiations and IPCC?
I mean, this is a key pillar of the Rio Convention, but it is vague, okay, and depart from dividing the world in a very simplified way, developed countries and developing countries, okay? And so it doesn't consider that developing countries are extremely stratified, I mean, in terms of per capita income. So, and this is one of the problems of the Rio Convention, that this has not used the classification of countries of the World Bank, that is much better, more sophisticated, and classify the countries in 4 levels: high income, high middle income, low middle income, and low income. Okay, so one problem with this principle is how high middle income countries use being in the category of developing countries for avoiding taking significant responsibility. Okay, but the principle say that everybody is responsible for climate change, but some countries are more responsible and some countries have the obligation, the countries that are more responsible, that have produced it historically. The idea historically is debatable. A lot of things remain vague. So the interpretation of the principle became a major problem in the dynamic of the convention. In my view, this is one of the weakest points, not the principle, but the fact that there was not a more complex classification of developing countries.
Maybe what we can also add is that the signature of the Paris Agreement in 2015 kind of changed a bit how CBDRC is being interpreted and discussed, because it adds in the light of national circumstances. And that's kind of it's another of those very vague expressions that you find in the Paris Agreement and in the UNFCCC. But it is supposed to highlight the fact that some economies now and some countries do play a bigger role in how much they emit, and especially emerging countries. And that's supposed to be a sign to bring them on board also to take ambitious action. So it's an attempt to try to add another layer of differentiation in the UNFCCC, but knowing that it's still very contested and still today being discussed a lot in the negotiations.
I wanted to ask you more about that as well, because there was that change and there were a few other kind of key changes in the Paris Agreement that shifted things a little bit. So I was hoping you could talk about that. You mentioned like this difference around developing countries, but I know there was also the hybrid multilateralism thing introduced and kind of bringing non-state actors in more. So I wonder if you could talk a bit about how Paris changed the negotiations and also the pathways to obstruction a little bit.
The Paris Agreement is a product of the failure of the reform of the Kyoto Protocol. The Kyoto Protocol settled a kind of mandatory goals of reduction emissions for developed countries. Okay, so the Kyoto Protocol was based on the idea of precision in relation to the obligations of developed countries, but not in relation to developing countries, of course. So what happened is that at the time of the reform of the Kyoto Protocol, there was an idea that the principle of having mandatory goals should be extended to all countries. Of course, very different kind of mandatory according to their per capita income and capabilities, let's say. But this failed, okay, for many reasons. And so the Paris Agreement was a kind of second best in relation to something, a stronger agreement. At the same time, it's a principle that bottom up. Each country say what I can do, and I will implement. And there is no idea of any punishment if you don't implement. Significant punishment, let's say. Okay, that it was in the Kyoto Protocol, but didn't have enough teeth anyway. So from this point of view, this is a major change. It's universal that any country has obligations, but the obligations are defined by each country according to whatever criteria, okay? And these obligations are not mandatory. There were attempts of saying, okay, these are the goals should be mandatory. They should be legally binding, okay? But there was the strong opposition of the United States and India to this kind of, India is more complex, okay? But the United States, not necessarily the Obama administration was against, but the Obama administration was saying, and everyone knew, that to pass in the American Senate any treaty that had legally binding goals of reduction emissions would not pass the American Senate. That is very difficult to pass any international treaty in the American Senate historically.
And on your point on the role of non-state actors, I think that's also an important shift that we saw with the signature of the Paris Agreement, where we knew while negotiating the treaty that adding up the voluntary commitments by countries wouldn't lead us to limit the global warming to 2 degrees or 1.5. That's what is being called the emission gap. And the idea was that this emission gap could be reduced by giving non-state actors, and especially obviously the private sector, a bigger role in the transition. That's why with the Paris Agreement, we have this whole discussions around hybrid multilateralism, about orchestration of the action of non-state actors to try to reduce this emission gap in a context in which in the past, the private sector was kind of more like either opposed or in favor of a treaty, of the Kyoto Protocol, notably. But then we saw really changes around the Paris Agreement with the private sectors and the industry wanting to play also a bigger role, and also not only at the national level, but also internationally to bring up and to have this kind of bigger dialogue and initiatives being also discussed at the multilateral level.
So you mentioned in this chapter, and we talked a little bit about it already, but the sort of operations of the UNFCCC and the IPCC and how those enable or empower obstruction. And I was hoping you could talk about that a little bit. Just what are some of the ways that these organizations are set up to allow obstruction?
I can start and mention two, and then Eduardo can jump in anytime. I think first there is the question of access and participation to both the IPCC and UNFCCC, in the sense that even though everyone, like every representative of a country, is welcome to participate and be part of those institutions, it does require quite a lot of resources, human resources, but also financial resources. For the IPCC, it also means quite a lot of epistemic resources, being able to understand the very technical discussions that go on in the IPCC. And that does mean, because there are huge asymmetries and structural asymmetries between countries, that does mean that often those who have the most capacities are also the most represented in those institutions, because they can send more delegates. They can also stay overnight. They can stay longer if the negotiations do not finish on time. And so obviously that makes them have bigger influence on what's going on in those institutions. And And the second, I think, is, and that's also similar, and it's a practice and procedure in both institutions, is the fact that decisions are taken by consensus, which means that every country has a say and a voice and can at any time oppose a decision, oppose an agreement, which means that everything has to be made to try to find a compromise to get them on board. And that gives some countries, and especially those countries who want to do obstruction, also a big leeway and a big way to kind of really try to slow down the debate or have their views reflected in some of those documents negotiated.
Yeah, this is actually the idea of the consensus is one of the major vulnerabilities of the convention and the whole history of the regime. Okay, so that is just one country, and particularly if it is a country with some power. It doesn't need to be the strongest power. You can diminish the what is the agreement. Well, and so this is the idea that the consensus give the negotiation to the final decision of minimal common denominator, meaning the minimal ambition for fighting global warming.
When I was reading this chapter, especially this part about how access and resources really come to play in the IPCC and the UNFCCC, it also made me think about the academic research and the funding of it and how much more industry funding there is for that research in some countries than others. And I wonder how much that comes into play as an obstruction tactic as well.
I think, that's a difficult question because, the IPCC is not being funded by the private sector. It's being funded by the governments on a voluntary basis. But it's true that in the selection of the authors, it's possible, because it's being done based on the list provided by governments, it's possible to have authors who have been working for fossil fuel companies. We know, for instance, of authors from ExxonMobil or Saudi Aramco who have been authors in some of the IPCC assessments. But I wouldn't say it's necessarily because of them that we have this kind of openness to carbon capture and storage or carbon dioxide removal, which has been documented in the last reports. I think in general, the IPCC also wants to work very closely with the private sector and also wants, and it's part of a bigger narrative in which non-state actors and the private sector does play a big role in providing the solutions. So it's really part of a bigger change. And that's what I think the interesting point, the IPCC was kind of said, okay, let's have closer links. And we know from the previous president, Ho Sung Lee, for instance, was really open to having greater dialogues and input from the business industry. And so that might be one of the reasons, through the leadership of the IPCC, through the authors who are being part of the report, that we tend to give those technologies big roles in the transition, even though it's being criticized a lot. IPCC is aware of that. There have been discussions about how to also show some of the negative impacts that those technologies can have, notably on biodiversity, for instance, or water security.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, can we talk about which countries are the biggest problem? Which countries are the big obstructors? We know the United States, so we can talk about the United States more for sure, but what are the big obstructors? You mentioned them in this chapter, and I'd like to have you kind of list them and then give some examples of the kinds of things that they do to obstruct at the international level.
Yeah, so I guess the most obvious one, the most that has been discussed a lot in the literature, also in media reporting, is Saudi Arabia, because Saudi Arabia is very open and in a way and very like not deranged, or it's not posing Saudi Arabia a problem of being finger pointed as obstructing the negotiations and putting its veto. I think it's even part of the DNA. It's part of the identity of the Saudi delegation to have this very kind of aggressive, very forthcoming position and in the negotiations. So that's the kind of obvious one, I would say, but in a way extremely well done. I mean, it's impressive to see the Saudi navigate the different rooms and have their point of view being presented and listed in the discussions. So it's very effective, and it's not something they are really thinking, I think, very clearly about how to organize themselves and how to influence the negotiations. The second one, probably the biggest in a way, but it's the United States. United States, I think the difference with the Saudi is that the United States cares about the public opinion. It cares about what people are going to say and see of the United States within the negotiations, but also outside as wanting to have this kind of leadership role in the negotiations, even though in practice we know the United States has left and withdrew from the Kyoto Protocol, from the Paris Agreement, is a big opposer of historical responsibilities, which I think is obviously a very big problem, given that we need to have ambitious but also just action. The United States also has been really opposing a lot the loss and damage discussions in the negotiations, really opposing any discussions in terms of reparation and compensation. And that's why it took so many decades to have the loss and damage fund established at COP27.
There is a significant difference between Republican and Democratic administration. So, in general speaking, is a country that produces a lot of obstruction, even in democratic administration. But I mean, particularly the Biden administration was the first time that the United States has really a climate policy, because Obama didn't have. It was take some measures by executive order, but didn't have a climate policy. So we have a climate policy in the United States for the first time that is based in promoting renewable energy and nuclear energy, not in reducing emissions, because this wouldn't have support in Congress. But anyway, the difference between the Biden administration and the second Trump administration in terms of the impact in the global climate policy is giant. I mean, the impact of, and this is one problem that is very important. We are now living in a world that's extremely conflictive, extremely based in the priority of hard geopolitics considerations, okay, in a world in which the military spending is growing a lot in most countries. And so the world in which we are now is somehow the opposite of the world of 92, when the climate regime was born, and even the world of 2015, when the Paris Agreement was signed. Okay, so negotiations were always difficult for the reasons we have mentioned and are in the chapter. And now the negotiations have much more obstacles because of this new geopolitical, and particularly now with the Trump administration that is not being in the agreement. It is impacting. He's impacting a lot, many countries, okay? So openly or not. So this is a consideration by the United States. And I would say another obstacle that has been important is the position of China. Until 2014, previous to Paris Agreement, China has a non-cooperative policy at all. Okay, in 2014, after a negotiation between Obama and Xi Jinping, it moved from a non-cooperative to partially cooperative position in the negotiations. So this was very important for sure, and it's key. The Paris Agreement would not happen without this change in the Chinese position, but still, until now, See, China has become, right, it continues building coal-feed thermopower plants, but at the same time is a superpower of renewables, okay? And this is very important for China and for the world. But still, China continues to consider itself as a developing country. And this is a major problem for the advance of the negotiation.
Can I have you guys define the difference between procedural and substantive obstruction? And then maybe give some examples of those, both in the UNFCCC and the IPCC.
Yeah, so I can give you broadly a kind of overview, and then we can discuss examples. So we wanted in this chapter to have an easy way to look at obstruction in a way, and that's why we differentiated between procedural obstruction and substantial obstruction, knowing that obviously they are also clearly related. So looking at procedural obstruction is more when a country tries to delay the deliberation, when it puts its veto on some decisions, as we mentioned, that it's very important for decisions to be taken by consensus. So some countries do use a lot their veto to have their views reflected in the documents, and those can be UNFCCC decisions, but also IPCC summaries for policy makers. It can be also about taking the floor a lot to delay the deliberations that will be extended over the day, sometimes will be also extended overnight, which makes it very difficult for small delegations to be part of the negotiations. And substantial obstruction is then more about being obstructive on how a specific thematic area is going to be addressed. And obviously this can be done by delaying the discussions. And this can be, for instance, when discussing fossil fuel phase out in the negotiations. And that took so many years and decades even to finally have a proper discussion about fossil fuel phase out. But there are other examples in the chapter about loss and damage discussions, and how for a long time it has been kind of framed around the question of adaptation, and that only recently some negotiations have been allowed also to develop independently on loss and damage.
Something I thought was really interesting in this chapter, and maybe surprising for people who don't follow this so closely, is that there's almost never is energy being discussed explicitly in these negotiations. I wonder if you could talk about that and sort of why it was a big deal that at the wrap up of, I think it was COP28, that they actually mentioned fossil fuels in those negotiations. But yeah, why is energy not being talked about in explicit terms in these negotiations?
Well, I would say that there was, at the moment of the Rio Convention, all these things are related to the limitations and vulnerabilities of the Rio Convention. Okay? So what happened? At that time, countries that were leading, like the European Union, they were expecting that the most important was to reach a consensus, to reach a treaty. Okay? So, for example, if United States was against introducing energy openly in the discussion, also obviously all the oil exported, for example, okay? And so it's amazing that energy is not discussed. It's amazing that just in 28 there was a mention to transition away from fossil fuels. Really is, and this is kind of, say, in my view, the general limitations of the convention that anyway has produced global public awareness about the issue. Because imagine without the convention, the world without the convention, without the annual discussions about this. So the public awareness in the world about climate change would be dramatically lower. Okay, so the convention has been very important. The negotiations sometimes have been not useful, but generally there is a trajectory of progress. But with all these limitations, so I would say energy is not discussed because all the countries that are carbon intensive in the production of energy are against.
And there is this famous statement by Saudi Arabia, which was that the UNFCCC is not an energy treaty. So we can discuss emissions, but we shouldn't go too much into the details of how we can reduce those emissions and how we can also think about fossil fuel phase outs. But what is interesting is, and that's part of the chapter as well, and that's work that has been done by a colleague of ours, Stefan Aykut, which is that in a way, fossil fuels have been discussed in the UNFCCC meetings, but through the impact of climate policy on fossil fuel economies. And that's what is being called response measures. And it's agenda item in the negotiations that has been there for several decades. And that's where the consequences of the response measures are being discussed and what can be done to help countries that are heavily dependent on fossil fuel for the economy, what can be done to support their transition. That's obviously an agenda item and thematic area where Saudi Arabia has been pushing a lot to consider those very important, obviously, consequences. And today we discuss that as well on the just transition agenda item.
Yeah, that's super, super interesting. Kind of related to this, I wanted to talk about this phrase, unabated emissions, and why it's important for people to understand what that means and how it gets used as a loophole.
Well, it's a bit related to the previous question on the role of some of the technologies like carbon dioxide removal and carbon capture and storage in the IPCC. And it's true that this unabated emission statement became very important, very much discussed because it was mentioned in the Glasgow Pact at COP26. And the idea was that they were supposed to have a phase down of unabated emissions from coal, notably. And yeah, it's part of those terms that allow for consensus to be found. And because unabated is supposed to prolong the life of the fossil fuel industry and infrastructure, because there is this expectations that by deploying at large scale carbon dioxide capture and storage, we can continue to extract fossil fuel from the ground, but then capture the emissions at the source and store them underground. And this is a technology that has been discussed for several decades. There was actually a special report produced by the IPCC in 2005, if I remember correctly, which was expected to assess the role that CCS could play in the transition. It hasn't scaled up as expected. There are still a lot of uncertainties, a lot of debate, but we can see that it came back in the discussions because some countries and economies really hope very strongly that those technologies can help them continue extract fossil fuel. And there is now a very interesting discussion going on in the IPCC about how do we define unabated emissions? What is unabated infrastructure? And it's been going on because the IPCC, obviously, after COP26, became involved in the discussions about this definition. So there have been IPCC authors, trying to find some kind of definition to assess whether an infrastructure is really producing unabated emissions or not.
Interesting. Okay, we've talked about non-state actors a little bit and how they've been increasingly welcomed and active in this process. Can you talk a little bit about specifically what types of non-state actors are getting involved and where do they play a role in obstruction?
There are a lot of non-state actors, but we can classify them in say, NGOs and business players. And also, there is more recently another non-state actor that is non-national state actor, but in some countries are important, particularly in democratic federative countries, that is the subnational government. But the most important are the business and the NGOs. At the beginning of the COPs, the idea of non-state actors were much more NGOs, because the business community was reluctant to the whole idea of the convention. Okay, when there were some changes, some perception in the business community, particularly promoted by the World Economic Forum since 2014, 15, and so on. So the business participation became very, very strong, and particularly increased dramatically the participation of business that are related to fossil fuels corporations. So we have today these worlds of the business community and the NGOs community. And there are some NGOs that are not the independent NGOs representing civil society, more public good like in the past, but that represent business interests and sometimes carbon-intensive business interests. And we can say that there are some business non-state actors that are more progressive and they recognize the need of decarbonization, and there are other businesses, non-state actors that are clearly conservative. They are in favor of the status quo, with different discourses that are not open saying that. And we have also in the NGO community, most of the NGO community is much more representative of civil societies, national civil societies and global civil society. But there are also a significant part of growing of NGOs that are much more dependent on related to the business community, and both sides, but particularly what is the major problem is with NGOs that are related to fossil fuels, non-state actors.
And maybe building on that, what we see is because of this whole Paris Agreement, which is expected to orchestrate action by non-state actors, we see a great interest from non-state actors and especially the private sector in COPs. They go to COPs because they can showcase their latest technologies and solutions. They can be part of different side events where they show how they are becoming leaders in the transition. They are also there to lobby government representatives, and there have been studies and by different organizations really showing how there are more and more lobbyists from the fossil fuel industry being part not only of government delegations, but also going to COPs to be part of side events, to do also deals with different countries and actors. I think there is still in general some more knowledge and research that would be needed to really understand what those actors are actually doing at COP and what's their potential of influencing the negotiations, knowing that still today, and that has always been the case, for non-state actors to have an impact and an influence on decision-making processes, being it NGOs or the private sectors, it's more effective to do it nationally.
Could I have you talk a little bit about the efforts that are working to reveal this obstruction or oppose it, including your own work, this book, academic research, activism, journalism? What are the things that are pushing back against this? And do you see any that are particularly effective?
Yes. So there has been quite a lot going on in the negotiations and also in the side events to try to name and shame, in a way, those actors who are obstructing negotiations, but also policy making nationally. And we can mention the notorious fossil of the day that is being awarded by NGOs to some of the countries who have been obstructing the discussions. So that's, those kind of naming and shaming practices and strategies are being used a lot by civil society. And obviously they provide this kind of really important moral dimension and moral argument in the negotiations. Is the fact that we also have a very active and influential coalition of countries who are the most vulnerable to climate change. And here I'm thinking about the AOSIS, the Alliance of Small Island Developing States, which has been very active as well to kind of push for more ambitious action, that has been also active in trying to bridge between different countries and developed and developing countries. And that's something that I find very interesting, which, because it's an initiative that brings together not only these countries, it's being pushed by them, but it also initiated also from discussions, academic discussions, is this non-proliferation agreement on fossil fuel. And that's being discussed and increasingly also supported in the negotiations, which I find an interesting example of how to build collaborations and support from different actors, being civil society, government representatives, as well as researchers.
We're coming up to the COP in Brazil, and I know Brazil came up in this chapter a couple times too. So I'm curious to hear what you think we can expect to see at this COP, what people should be looking for.
The international situation in which this COP is going to happen is extremely difficult because of the new American administration. This is a major problem, but also is what I said before about the priority of national security today, how this affects all countries that has diminished the attention significantly to climate change mitigation. Okay, so this is a major obstacle for the convention for COP3. And I would say, for example, the one issue that is key in obstacle of the negotiation is the major difference of position between developing countries and developing countries, generally speaking. Okay, so this is a major obstacle. Okay, and there is from one side there is less and less availability for financing from developed countries, and from the other side there is growing resentment in developing countries, I would say, particularly in low income and low middle income countries, in relation to developed countries and to the credibility of the negotiation. This is something that is accumulating a lot, okay? And it's going to be more difficult this year. In my view, there are two things that are favorable in this COP. One is that the first one in a democratic country after 3 COPs in autocracy. So in the environment of the COPs, there is a diffuse influence of when you have a lot of an atmosphere of civil society mobilization that could be extremely intense in this case, because Brazil is promoting the participation of civil society, national and international, even with all the vulnerability of Brazil, because it has a good policy for controlling deforestation right now, but the land use change, but not about oil exploration. That is, Brazil is becoming more and more one of the most important oil exported in the world. Okay, so this is the ambivalence of the schizophrenia of the Lula administration. But anyway, the Brazilian government is promoting, and there is another thing that I think is relevant, and this is an uncertainty, in my view. The uncertainty is what would be the role of China in this convention. Okay, would China take advantage of the vacuum because there is no more European Union leadership okay? And United States is in the opposite side of the convention. So would China take advantage and change positions, saying, okay, we recognize we are a global superpower, a global economy, a superpower in all dimensions, and we cannot be considered anymore a developing country. We have many of the dimensions of developed country. Even if the per capita income is still in the high middle income, is not high income. I think theoretically this could happen. There is a high probability of this to happen. No, it's a low probability. But this, if there is a movement of China in that direction, whatever the specificities of this movement, this will create a new kind of environment in this COP that could diminish the negative situation of today of the world and global climate policy, and even could be very favorable for China, but because could reduce the opposition to China in democratic countries, because China is an autocracy, okay? So there is, because theoretically, because I don't have any inside information about China, okay, this, I think, this could happen. The other thing that I think is important is what will be the role of the Brazilian president, not the Brazilian government behavior in the negotiation that will be like any other country, but the Brazilian president. The most important goal of the Brazilian president is securing the continuity of the negotiation. It's a low ambition goal, okay? So the danger is the implosion of the COP. So this is our goal, to keep the COP going on. So for that, we need to have a very low ambition position in terms of hard matters, let's say, okay? But we can create an atmosphere of discussion that is more forward-thinking without entering in very tough issues in relation to emissions, for example. But yes, for example, trying to circumvent, try to avoid the deepening of the, let's say, of the resentment and low credibility by developing countries in relation to the COP mechanism, something like this. So it's uncertain. The COP is uncertain.
Yeah, I would really agree with Eduardo on the question of trust and the resentment, the lack of trust that we have seen in the last years. I was in Baku at COP29. I was also this June in Bonn. And the negotiations are stuck on several issues because of the disappointment of the new collective quantified goal on finance, which is seen as completely way too weak by developing countries. And I think that's being a really big challenge for the Brazilian presidency to try to bring trust between the countries, but also to try to restore trust in the process, taking into account also that the United States pulled out, that the EU is increasingly sometimes having to take the same statements and kind of obstructive a bit kind of positions that the US used to take, for instance, on finance and loss and damage. So I think it's going to be an important COP to try to talk about this question of trust and resentment and how to move forward in this new, very complicated, terrifying world.
That's it for this time. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss an episode. You can find more on this season, including transcripts and lots of related articles and background information on our website at drilled.media. You can also sign up for our newsletter there. Our producers for this season are Martin Zaltz-Ostwick and Peter Duff. Our theme song is Bird in the Hand by Foreknown. Our cover art is by Matthew Fleming. Our First Amendment attorney is James Wheaton with the First Amendment Project. The show was created, written, and reported by me, Amy Westervelt. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.